This is a warning. This is a warning for the young believers or the people who just became Christians. It's probably best to find a Bible-believing church or a Bible-teaching church. A church that teaches all of the Bible, not just the Old Testament or not just teaching the New Testament, but all of it in context. One of the obvious things about the church is money. And, for the new believers, they may tell you that you don't have to give. But after a while, after attending that church for a few times, there's an expectation already. You will be asked to give. You'll be expected to give. And many times, they'll even give you guilt trips that you have to give. Because according to them, the Bible says so. While that issue is very controversial, there's different arguments for and against the tithe. They call it the tithe. We're not going to get into that. That's something you're going to have to research for yourself. The passing of offering plates. There's nowhere in the Bible that says that a church has to pass offering plates to make people give. If you study the background of that, that's basically the church operating on a corporate level. They need the income from the people to stay alive. Yes, they may claim that they're a non-profit organization, but what a lot of people don't understand about non-profit organizations is that whatever they get from donations, they will get to keep, and they get to keep it as income. At least the leaders or the board of directors, that's what they get. And a lot of times the volunteers think that they're working for a non-profit organization, so everybody's volunteering, but that's not the case. There are the people who are in charge of that non-profit. They make the money. They make the income. They're making a living from the donations. So you got to keep that in mind when you first start going to a church. That's gonna happen. They're gonna pass offering plates. They're gonna expect you to give money. Many people can confirm this. They've been to churches where the ones who are the big givers or the big tithers, they're the ones that are getting treated well versus the ones that don't give. It's basically social engineering. They socialize people into thinking it's normal to give and give and give, and then to even ask for 10% of your income. You see someone speaking in front of the pulpit who's a representation of authority, and when the person sees all these people listening to that authority, the members are expected to obey and expected to listen and expected to follow everything that they say, even though it may not be biblical or ethical. There's been many stories of people who they're even forced to even give more than the 10% of their income. And for the people who can afford it, more power to them. But knowing how the economy is nowadays, it may not be always practical. You've even heard televangelists even say that to borrow from their credit cards, and that is kind of borderline psychopathic, to ask people who don't have a lot of money to borrow from their credit cards just so they can give to a ministry. That's very questionable. Another issue when you first go to church is people are going to be expected to volunteer. So a lot of church members will be expected to volunteer, stacking chairs, cooking in the kitchen, washing dishes. It's especially sad for the musicians, because you see ads online where churches are looking for musicians, and a lot of times they don't pay. They say there's no pay, everyone's a volunteer. But if you really think about that, it's not really a volunteer issue, because those musicians are paying for gas, and they go to that church and they're expected to give tithes and to give money. So it's almost like it's a pay-to-play situation which is very looked down upon in the music industry. And so expect that you are going to be expected to volunteer at a church. And there will be some guilt trips coming your way. Another issue that you might come across, you will become used to that family setting in a church. You will be used to them. They'll be your social network. And that's part of the socialization process. You become accustomed to a family type setting. You get used to seeing them every Sunday or other days of the weekend or other days of the week for Bible studies. People become dependent on that fellowship. And when they become dependent on that fellowship, a lot of times there's conflicts in people's minds because they may hear teachings that may not be biblical, and they could be afraid to question it because they're already part of the family and they don't want to betray them, and it would be hard to leave because they spend so much time and they also spend so much of their emotions. So it's hard to leave. They spend so much money giving in that church and even time volunteering. When they contemplate on leaving, they hear stories like, you'll never find a perfect church. It's another one of those guilt trips to make people not want to leave. People get stuck in this situation where they feel like they want to leave, but they can't. And the sad thing about that is when they finally do leave, sometimes there's a backlash. Keep in mind, they have established friendships and family, so it becomes harder for them to leave. So these are the kind of issues that you might come across when you first become a believer. And not to discourage you to not go to church, but I would encourage you to take your time in finding a church. Don't just go for a church because it's size or the worship team or how charismatic the pastors or the leaders are, but really study the doctrine that they teach. And I would even suggest go to a couple of churches, go to 3, go to 4, so you have fellowship with a lot of people. There's no law that you have to stick to only one church, even though there's a lot of churches that give that kind of guilt trip that you have to go only grow with one church, you have to only go to one church. But see, that's almost like mind control. That's brainwashing. That's not really biblical. You should be able to fellowship with different churches, different Bible-based Christian churches.